Well, thank you, Audrey, and thank you everyone for joining us on this beautiful evening. I'm excited to share a bit about New Hampshire's bats. I'm Sandy Houghton with the Non-Game and Endangered Wildlife Program at New Hampshire Fish and Game, joined by Haley. So tonight we're just going to go through a quick bit about bats in New Hampshire and white nose syndrome, and then transition into how you can help. So I want to start with a tribute to bats and why they're cool. A lot of this is probably will be a refresher or review or stuff you know, but I think it's fun to highlight. Bats are nocturnal. Bats fly. They're our only mammal that can truly fly. They use echolocation, sending out a high-pitched sound and listening for an echo. And this helps them both to navigate through the forest at night. They can see, and they can see slightly better than us, but this lets them do it in a really agile way. And it also helps them to hone in on their prey. So they're our largest predator of night-flying insects. So they're able to find that agricultural pest or forest pest, mosquito, all different sorts of things. One study found that the loss of all North American bats would result in over $3 billion in agricultural losses just based on their pest control contribution. They're really small, so if you look in on this photo, you'll notice the researcher's thumb in the foreground. This is a little brown bat, and if you look towards the left-hand side of this photo, you'll see a band, and this band is an individual marker that researchers use to learn more about bats, and from that we've learned that bats are really long-lived. So we've had little brown bats documented living as long as 30 years. Also, it helps us to learn where they're going. So some of our bats do go to winter in Vermont and New York and other places. So moving into kind of thinking about a year in the life of a bat. So right now, as we're enjoying spring and nice weather, it's gotten warm. I've started to see a few bats flying around in my backyard. I'm sure some of you have as well. They've emerged from hibernation and they're replenishing their fat stores. So they're eating a lot, and pregnancy is initiated. And then, sorry, I need to figure out, there we go. They're moving to their summer habitat. So that might be in the forest, a barn, or different habitats. And some of the bats, the females will form maternity colonies. It can be just a few bats in a crevice of a tree, or we have little brown bat colonies that had been documented over 1,000 prior to white nose syndrome. Now we have several that are in the hundreds. They're taking advantage of being in a group for both predation and warmth. So there's less energy needed to maintain their body heat. They can put that towards growing and having pups. So for little brown bats, their pups are born from late May until mid-July. In general, the average is mid-June. And then for the next month, they're not able to fly. So they're really dependent on their mothers as a food source. And then they start flying in June, and everyone heads towards where they're going to spend the winter. And there's a period called fall swarming, and it's a really concentrated bat activity in and around the area where they'll be hibernating. Mating occurs during this time. And then by October, they're headed back into hibernation. In general, if you think about it, the insects are gone. So they're going to lower their metabolic rate, their heart rate, and go into hibernation before the cycle starts again. So taking a closer look at some of these habitats, on the left, these two trees on the left and the bottom center are actually documented roost trees, but you can see the bark peeling up, forming kind of that tight crevice where a bat could roost during the day and be safe from predators, or in the hole or crevice of a tree. And then they might use structures that kind of imitate those natural areas. So it could be under the shingles of a house, under the flashing, or in a bat house itself. We had talked about some of the larger colonies, they might use the eaves of a barn. And then we have the eastern small-footed bat, which is roosting or spending their days resting in the crevices of rocks. So they're unusual in that way. But generally, I think of them all as being kind of that tight place that's safe from predators where they can rest comfortably. And then switching gears towards our the winter habitat. Here we have a picture of a mine. You can see there's water in it that's keeping that high humidity. It's generally over 80% humidity. Most of our mines are over 90%, and sometimes like the meters really can't tell the difference between once you get over 95%. So, and then the temperature is stable. So it's above freezing, but it might be just above freezing to about 40 degrees in most of the sites we've documented. And staying generally in that range. So it's warmer than it would be, you know, when we get to those 15 to negative degree days in the winter, but certainly not tropical. But we have 5 bats that will hibernate in caves and mines. Those are all shown here. And then if you think about the insects being gone, that kind of another strategy for dealing with the lack of food and prey would be to migrate. So we have 3 bats in New Hampshire, the red bat, the hoary bat, and the silver-haired bat, that are called migratory bats, and they're migrating south for the winter, where they're able to stay active. There might be temporary bats of torpor, but they're not going into that deep hibernation like the other bats in the caves and mines. These 3 bats are also larger bodied. Their wingspan is over a foot in general. So together, just a quick bringing it all together, we have 8 species of bat here in New Hampshire at different times of the year. And on the left-hand side, highlighted in the green boxes, are those migratory bats. So those are the ones heading south for the winter. And they're generally foraging in more open habitats here when they're here in the summer. These bats, conservation concerns are loss of habitat and then threats that they may encounter during their migration, such as wind turbines. And then our 5 hibernating bats are highlighted in red. And those are our bats that are using the caves and mines throughout New Hampshire during the winter, and their biggest conservation concern is white nose syndrome. And you can see 4 out of the 5 are listed as state endangered here in New Hampshire, and then the northern long-eared bat is also federally threatened. So to touch on white nose syndrome briefly, and how it's impacted our populations here in New Hampshire. It was first documented in 2009, 2010, and it's affecting the bats during the winter when they're hibernating in the caves or mine. And the first sign is the white fungus. It's not always apparent, but in this photo, you can see growing on the nose, ears, wings. And generally, so as researchers didn't know what was going on, they were looking up and they saw the white nose. So that's where the name comes from. Since then, a whole team of scientists from all disciplines have come together and have determined a few things. The fungus is new to science. It's known as Pseudogymnoascus destructans. It grows really well in that damp cave environment and the cold temperatures. And it's really easily transmitted. It's a fungus with spores that can travel pretty well by both bats or humans. So we've definitely seen, initially it started in New York and spread through the Northeast and South, and it's headed pretty far west. And we had one leap in, I think, 2015 or 16 to Washington State. I think, yeah, so it's kind of all coming together, unfortunately, where most regions of the United States have white nose syndrome. In general, the bats appear to die from a disruption in their metabolism. And here in New Hampshire, we saw really dramatic declines in our winter population. So as you can remember, 2009 was when it was first documented. By 2010, 11, our surveys were showing, that the winter population was really decimated. 2012 and 14, really no recovery, and by 2018, kind of had leveled off. So I guess it's been different by species. So big brown bats and eastern small-footed bats have been doing a little bit better. Their numbers have been somewhat stable now. And then northern long-eared bats are generally not seen during our winter surveys. We do pick them up during our acoustic surveys. And we had one little brown bat documented. We do have little brown bats documented during our summer surveys, so they are they are surviving, either using unknown habitats here in New Hampshire, or they could be going out of state. Like I mentioned earlier, some of our bats will go to caves and mines in Vermont and New York. A recent genetic study of some of Vermont's bats for little brown bats did show some evidence of a difference in the genes between the surviving little brown bats and those that they had samples from pre-white nose syndrome. So that's encouraging. In general, any recovery will be slow, as the bats have one young per year. And not every year, and it's certainly a big energy expenditure for them to have young. So we're working hard to help with the conservation and recovery of our surviving bats. And I'm going to transition now to let Haley share some ideas of how we can all help.
Thanks, Sandy. And thanks, everyone. I'm nursing a little bit of a sore throat, so bear with me, but I think I'll make it through. So, okay. You can go to the next slide, Sandy. So I get the part where we get to talk about conservation actions for bats, which I'm excited about because I think there's some stuff you can do for bats that's really accessible and can really benefit individual bats as well as the species and help us learn more about them. Next slide.
Is it going forward? I think I'm having trouble with this.
Go on the how you can help slide.
Yeah, it's not, I seem to have frozen. Let me see if this works. There we go.
Perfect. There you go.
Sorry about that.
No worries. We're in a Zoom world now for the last year. Everyone's used to it. All right. So one way that you can help bats in New Hampshire is to help us, New Hampshire Fish and Game, UNH Cooperative Extension, and other researchers who are interested in bats, learn more about where they are and in what numbers. And so volunteers throughout New Hampshire can contribute to our efforts by helping us to count bats as they emerge from their maternity colonies on summer evenings. And so this helps us find new maternity colonies. And it also provides us with data on the relative abundance of bats in any given location from year to year. And in a minute, I'll tell you how you can contribute data from these efforts, which are coordinated by Fish and Game and UNH Cooperative Extension. Next slide. So before I get into that, if it's progressing,
yeah, it doesn't seem to let me.
Did you stop sharing, Sandy?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know why it keeps freezing on us.
I have to unshare and share for every slide.
I know, hopefully not.
Hopefully it's good.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, it's working. All right, so just as a reminder on what maternity colonies are, Sandy just went over this a little bit in terms of the bat life cycle, but basically when the weather gets warmer in early summer, those pregnant female bats gather together in warm, safe places to have their babies. And we call these roosts where they're gathering maternity colonies. And many groups of bats return to the same site every year. And here in New Hampshire, these maternity colonies often occur in places that we can easily observe, places like abandoned houses, barns, church steeples, and even currently occupied structures like attics. And so all of those places can provide a summer home to female bats and their young. Next slide, maybe?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So we're likely to see 2 of New Hampshire's 8 bat species in these maternity colonies that are buildings or structures. The first one is little brown bats. And so they're one of New Hampshire's bat species that live in houses and barns in the summer. And they prefer buildings that are close to open water so that they have the ability to forage on mosquitoes and other aquatic insects. And they like to gather in really large colonies if they had their way and if they still occurred in really high abundance in the state. So prior to white nose syndrome, maternity colonies of little brown bats numbered in the hundreds or thousands. Unfortunately, because as Sandy mentioned, little brown bats are one of those bats that also hibernate in large numbers in caves and mines. They're spreading white nose syndrome amongst themselves at a really high rate. And so they're the species in New Hampshire that's the most susceptible to white nose syndrome. So we've seen population declines of this bat of more than 90% in the state of New Hampshire in the last decade. Next slide. And maybe not, next slide. And then big brown bats, while Sandy works on that.
I don't understand.
I know, it was working just fine for your slides. Brown bats are the other of the two species that humans encounter the most because they also roost in buildings in summer. And big brown bats are the most common attic bat that we would think of. So the most common bat that people have in their attics. You might also, it's the bat that most people might see because at night after feeding, they often rest in garages or on porches. And so if you see a bat on the side of a building or on your porch, chances are it's a big brown bat. And they can sometimes be found hibernating in buildings in the winter. So unlike little brown bats that are exclusively using caves and mines for hibernation, big brown bats are a little bit larger in size, and that allows them to tolerate slightly more variability in the humidity and temperature conditions that they can tolerate while hibernating. And so on occasion, they will actually hibernate in buildings. So in your attic, for instance. Sandy, would you like me to take over sharing?
Sure.
Okay.
That might be easier.
Yep. Let me pull it up. Technology. Can everyone see that? Oh, I guess I have to stay full screen. Can everyone see that? Okay, great. So that's a little bit about what a maternity colony is and the couple of bat species that we have in New Hampshire that you're likely to encounter when conducting a bat count at a maternity colony. And just briefly, I'm going to go through what conducting a bat count looks like. We have a more detailed training that we're going to be offering in May. And so when I can exit out of full screen, I'll put in the chat a link that will let you sign up for our New Hampshire Bat Counts Project newsletter. And that's going to announce any upcoming trainings, news we have about the New Hampshire Bat Counts Project, results from every survey season. You can sign up for that if you're interested in learning more and getting more detailed information about how to conduct a bat count. But basically, again, conducting a bat count helps us learn more about where maternity colonies are, where bats are doing well, the types of structures that they're actually using for these colonies. And it's just not possible for Sandy, myself, the other biologists in the state who are thinking about bats to know where these maternity colonies are because most of them are occurring on private land. They're distributed all over the state of New Hampshire. And again, they're in barns and attics. So like, you just cannot know where they are without the help of volunteers and landowners submitting their data. And so just to give you an idea of how and when this happens, we ask volunteers to conduct at least one count or preferably two between June 3rd and June 23rd. So in the month of June, basically. And this is before most bat pups fly. And then another count, but again, preferably two, basically in the month of July, between July 8th and July 28th. And that's after most pups fly. So that gives us a good count, a bat pup estimate before pups and after pups. You don't need a lot to conduct a bat count. It's really simple. Something to write with, a piece of paper to tally, a bat colony count data form that's available on our website, on New Hampshire Fish and Game's website, and guides you through everything that you need to keep track of while you're counting bats. Some bug spray is a good idea, a flashlight since it's going to be dark when you're done counting, and a clipboard or something to write on. So really simple. And if you're at a ton of bats, you might want one of those handheld clickers. But the sad reality is that not a lot of sites have that number of bats at this point. When you're getting ready to think about counting, the first thing we recommend to people is even in advance of the night you're going to count at one of these sites, it's just a good idea to observe the site. So especially if you're someone who's not sure if you have bats or where they're coming from, get outside on a night where you see bats flying around and try and keep track of where they're coming in, where they're headed into, and where they're coming out of, in whatever structure they're using, your barn, your attic, and get a feel for where they're entering and exiting. For some sites, it might be multiple locations. And in that case, it's often useful to recruit help, other people in your household, your friends and neighbors, to count with you. And then you want to be sure to pick a good night for counting. So you want it to be clear. You want there to be no wind, no rain, preferably, and over 50 degrees, so that you can guarantee that bats are about as active as they're going to be on a summer evening. And then for the actual count, it's really simple. You start counting, you write down the time when you see the first bat. You tally the bats that enter and exit the structure of the maternity colony. And then when you kind of don't see much movement anymore, you wait another 15 minutes and you stop counting. And that's it. That's a bat count. And then after that, we have instructions on our website and on the data form for submitting data to Sandy at Fish and Game, either via email, via regular mail, or this year we're hoping to, if we can manage in time, launch an online data submission process. So just to show you, this is the New Hampshire Fish and Game Bat website. Right up at the top, it's the first thing. That's how important it is that volunteers submit data to this project to be a summer bat counter. And so if you click on that Learn How, it'll bring you to a lot of detailed information about how to do a bat count, much more detailed than I've gone into this evening. Data forms, both a one-time form we ask people to fill out about the site, and then a count data form that we ask them to fill out every time they count bats. And then again, submission information. And we used to do these trainings in person, and we hope to again in the future, but given the current circumstances, we haven't been able to. But there is a video on the website that you can watch where it demonstrates the count. And that's really useful and kind of the best thing we have in lieu of in-person trainings where we could demonstrate a count together. So that's worth watching if you're interested. All right, so in addition to counting bats and submitting that data, if you're not interested in that or not able to for some reason, we're also just interested in knowing if you have bats, and specifically colonies of 10 or more. So if you have bats in your attic or your barn and you just notice, anecdotally that there's a significant number of bats, again, more than 10 individuals, we have a form on the New Hampshire Fish and Game website, again, on that main page, and I'll put the link in the chat when I can access it, to report bat colonies. And so it's just, again, helpful to us. We can't be everywhere. We don't have eyes all over the state of New Hampshire, except for yours, of individual volunteers and landowners who are willing to share this information so that we can understand where bats occur in the state, the types of structures they're using, and in what numbers they might occur. So really useful. And, even if you don't have bats, you can share this with friends or family or neighbors who do. All right, so in addition to volunteering and reporting data about bats to New Hampshire Fish and Game, there's other ways that you can help bats. So one is to let them use the habitats that they've been using for centuries, which in reality today is your barn. And so if you have bats, one of the best things you can do is to just let them use the places that they're already using. Sometimes we come across folks who want to do right by the bats, but are not so interested in maybe having bat guano or bat poop on their equipment, their tractor, their lawnmower, and we totally understand that. And so homeowners or barn owners have come up with some interesting solutions, often involving tarps or false ceilings that basically capture the guano, that are easily removed for cleaning, but that allow the bats to stay in the barn in a way that then does not kind of trash, for lack of a better word, the equipment or items of interest of the homeowner. And so that's kind of a win-win if you're interested in helping the bats, but again, you don't want their droppings all over your equipment. So yeah, letting them use your barn is a great thing you can do. That doesn't take much effort. But bats don't stay in barns. They also occur in attics. And I'm sure many of you on this presentation out there in the audience have had bats in your home or attic. And in those situations, often the homeowner really wants to remove those bats, understandably. And so if you are going to remove bats from your home, the best thing you can do is, keep in mind that life cycle that Sandy presented earlier, and avoid removing the bats or excluding the bats during a time where there's going to be pups roosting in that attic or enclosed space. And that means avoiding exclusions in New Hampshire through basically from mid-May through August. So anytime where those maternity colonies are going to occur in those attic spaces, you want to avoid excluding those bats, because if you do exclude the bats, at sometimes you might just be excluding the female mothers and not the young. And so you run the risk of capturing and basically killing bats in your attic, which no one wants. And then on top of that, I'll also say there are structures where, again, as I mentioned, big brown bats might be overwintering in some of these situations. And so if you can avoid exclusion during the hibernation period, where you might inadvertently trap them in there prior to their spring departure, that's great to avoid as well. So ultimately, April and September are great times for bat exclusion here in New Hampshire. But at bare minimum, you want to avoid, again, that summer roosting season. And this probably looks familiar to some folks. Even if you don't know what it is, you might have seen these on the side of a building, but installing a bat house is another thing you can do for bats. And that's especially beneficial if you are going to be excluding bats from a barn or an attic, to give them another alternative habitat to use that's nearby. So bat houses are basically just an artificial bat roosting site. And they look like a box, but they're a little bit more complicated than that, in that there is a particular design and particular features and characteristics that you want to make sure they have, and different particular installation techniques that you want to use in order to give the best shot that bats are going to be able to inhabit that bat house successfully. Generally, you want to have a bat house that's pretty large in size, that's dark in color and faces south or southeast, so that it gets nice and warm, because that's what those bats are looking for in a maternity site. And then that's more than 12 feet high and potentially or ideally mounted to the side of a building, because those are the types of places where bats are looking for maternity roost sites. And I put this up, from Bat Conservation International, just to say, again, there are really specific criteria for building a bat house, and again, setting you up for success. There's no guarantee that bats are going to use these places, but if you follow well-researched protocols, it's more likely that they might. And Bat Conservation International is a great resource for information on how to build and install bat houses. So that's batcon.org, and they have really useful guides and resources on their website. And then, aside from artificial or human created habitat, you can also make efforts to maintain or enhance habitat features for bats on the landscape. And so one of the ways to do that is to keep forests as forests. So just to promote, large forest habitat blocks, particularly forested areas next to riparian zones. So around water features, wetland buffers, so forest around wetlands. Basically places you can think about that are forested that would also be buggy and provide like nice open areas for them to do some feeding. Those are the types of places that bats are looking for. And so that might feel really big and landscape scale. But for those of you who are private landowners, or maybe on a local conservation commission or involved in your town, little decisions that you make related to management and conservation add up and make a difference on a landscape scale. And for those of you who aren't, supporting local conservation efforts or talking to others about these important habitat features is really useful. You can also protect, as Sandy pointed out, some of these individual roost trees that are really important. And so she mentioned that this, on the left was a roost tree that was known and identified, but we want to not only protect known and identified roost trees, we also want to protect potential roost trees. Because while some bats are using the same sites year after year, there's new bats and situations where bats need to find new roost sites. So we want to protect trees that have those cavities, have those crevices, have those cracks that bats are looking for. And so this can be in any species of tree, any tree that's over 3 inches in diameter. And so retaining during any sort of normal forestry activities or any sort of basic land management that you're doing, making sure to keep some of those snags, which are basically dead standing trees, and cavity trees, so trees with holes, keeping those on the landscape and in the forest are going to benefit bats. And then when you think about timing in terms of cutting trees, ideally you want to cut trees in the winter, so not to disrupt bats. That's the best you can do for bats, is to cut trees in the winter so that there's no chance that they're roosting inside. At a bare minimum, you want to really avoid cutting trees in June and July. So anything you can do when you think about timing to benefit bats in terms of your forestry or tree cutting activities is beneficial. And I'll just bring up this slide to say that there's a ton more information about what you can do for bats, both in terms of just basic actions, but also additional resources. A great place to go for that is the New Hampshire Fish and Game website that has individual species profiles for all of the bats that Sandy mentioned. That includes actions you can take for those species. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is constantly updating their website with new information about white nose syndrome and other resources about bats at a national level. And then Bat Conservation International, as I mentioned, is a great nonprofit organization that has a wealth of resources and information about things you can do to benefit bats, including bat house design and installation instructions. So those are 3 really great sites to go to. And I will put some of the links I mentioned in the chat in the meantime. But with that, we're happy to answer any questions. I'll stop sharing, Audrey. Does that work for you? Unless you
Yeah, that works great. And we have lots of questions, and I beat you to the link. So
awesome. Thank you.
All the ones that you mentioned are in the chat already. So yeah, let's go to the questions. So thanks to all those folks submitting questions. And I'm actually going to start with Piper Bartlett Brown is giving a shout out to Portsmouth High School ecology students who are joining us tonight. And apparently you get extra credit for asking questions. So cue the questions up, folks.
Nice.
So we got a question from Nancy. She's asking about, is there any grant money to pay for suspending tarps in barns? She has seen neighbors hiring bat removal companies to keep bats out of their attic and their pretty old barn. And so she would love to see if she could find a program to maybe help them to coexist a little better with those bats. And she's also wondering, are there any laws that make it illegal to remove bats?
So I can take that one. In terms of grant money, right now, we do have a program where we're providing bat houses when folks are doing exclusions. We just have a few. It's kind of a pilot program, but basically bat houses are most likely to be used when they're offered as a habitat for bats who have been excluded. And by excluded, I think that's kind of a term that may not be in everyone's vocabulary for what it means, but it's allowing the bats, generally they'll set up a one-way door, and it's allowing the bats to get out, but then not get in. So there are acceptable management practices that were developed by the White Nose Conservation and Recovery Work Group in partnership with wildlife control operators. And those are referenced in the New Hampshire state rules. So in general, it should be done by exclusion. We allow for removal of individual bats. Obviously, there's sometimes a bat in a bedroom or those kind of things for testing. Otherwise, exclusion and following the acceptable management practices, and that it gets into a lot of details, but there's methods and ways that it can be done that I guess causes the least harm is the most acceptable methodology. For tarps, we don't currently have a program, but I am working with a couple folks who have little brown bat colonies that are of significant size, and we're trying to look at creative ways to help those bats. So certainly they're welcome to contact me, and I'd be happy to potentially arrange a site visit and see what we could do. It is a little hard to get to every site, so we try and prioritize based on species and number, unfortunately, just given limited resources.
Great, thanks. So we have another question. Are there any companies that you would recommend that build and install bat houses? I know we had the Bat Conservation International plans to build yourselves, but any other info on that?
I mean, I would say I don't have any locally, Sandy, other than, or not that are doing it on a wide scale. I mean, often you'll drive on the side of the road, see folks who build birdhouses and bat houses. And I would say in that situation, you want to make sure that they're designed with certain specifications in mind, and just make sure the person understands those specifications. You can purchase online as well. Sandy, I don't know if you have any specific companies in mind, but.
I know Bat Conservation International used to keep, and I think they may still have it, I just haven't looked at it recently, a list of companies by state that build bat houses that meet their standards. Basically larger is better, I think, and trying, if it's really tiny, like shoebox size, it's probably not ideal. But yeah, I think the Bat Conservation International will list the companies that would be by state. I can't think, I know there's at least one in New Hampshire, but I can't think of their name.
And I'll just add, I think well-intentioned people put in bat houses and then can get really disappointed when bats don't occupy it. And to Sandy's point, they are successful if you know there's bats nearby, especially if you're preparing to exclude them from the habitat they are using to provide them with that new habitat. But sometimes it can take multiple years for bats to catch on to even a well-built, well-installed bat house in an area. And at times they might never utilize it, unfortunately. But, so I just like to, not to be a downer, but to kind of set realistic expectations for folks that it's not like if you build it, they will come within weeks. Sometimes it takes time, and it might never happen, but, especially if you're excluding bats, it's really beneficial to give it a shot.
So here's a fun question, and it's one I haven't heard of, so I'm really curious as to the answer. The two-part question: can you hang a bat house on a tree is the first part, but the second part is, I heard you can try to attract bats to the house by hanging some bananas in a mesh bag at the bat house. Any truth to that?
So with trees, there's two concerns, and one is making sure you get the sunlight on the bat house. So we're trying to create that warm environment, and so with trees you may not get that. And then the other concern is a perch for a predator, such as an owl, could be available on the tree. So they're less likely to be used. Any of the research that's been done shows that the houses that are on like the side of the barn or a structure are more often used than the ones that are on a tree. But certainly it could be worth a try if you're not, setting them up near an owl perch and it's getting sunlight. And the banana thing, I've never heard of that, and I'm not aware. We often get the how can we attract bats, and it's basically they may, it can take a few years for them to become familiar with them. And like Haley said, if you have bats in your area and you see them flying, if you're near a water resource, and you have a lot of insects in the area, it's more likely to be occupied. Again, yeah, that's kind of the overview. There's a lot of great resources that go into more detail.
Great. So Ava is wondering if there is a cure for white nose syndrome, or if scientists have found a way to slow down the spread. What's the status of that?
So there's a bunch of different things that have been found effective in terms of like aerosol sprays and in trial of vaccine. And those are being tested out further to the west of us. We've kind of been through it for 10 years. So for whatever reason, the bats that we have survived and are continuing to survive at their low numbers. So that hasn't been our focus here in New Hampshire.
We have a couple folks asking if there's other reasons that we're seeing declines in bats aside from white nose syndrome.
You take that, Sandy. Yeah, I mean, white nose syndrome is really the main driver of some of those significant declines that you've heard about in the news. But in addition to that, loss of habitat for bats, like many other wildlife species, is a major issue and a reason that we're seeing some of their declines. Particularly bats require suitable foraging habitats, so places where they can acquire a large amount of insects. Roost sites, which we've talked about, right? These are really warm places or places out in the crevices and cracks of trees. And then hibernacula, so places where they can overwinter. So they require all those different habitat zones. And all of those can be impacted by development, loss of forested habitat, so removal of forest from the landscape, and then just human activity. So things we're doing to remove that habitat. And then also in addition to that, Sandy mentioned briefly, wind turbines do have the ability to impact some of those migratory bats. So, if a large group of bats are flying through an area where there are wind turbines, as they move to their hibernacula, migrate to their hibernacula, that can have put a pretty big ding in a local population, potentially. So those are kind of some of the major threats. I don't know if there's anything else, Sandy, that you would want to mention.
I think you covered it pretty well. Thank you.
And are there any solutions with the wind turbines for migrating bats? Does the speed that the blades are turning affect them?
Yeah, so basically bats are most active when it's above 50 degrees. So there's temperature and then there's wind speed. So when it's really windy, bats are less likely to be active. So if they're able to curtail the wind turbines at those lower wind speeds and not start generating energy until it gets really, windier, that decreases the probability of any bat fatalities. So did that explain it? Did that make sense? Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So Maya had a question about if you were to see a bat with white nose syndrome, or maybe you can just comment on if you find any bat, in your yard or something like that. Is there something that we can do to help it, or is it best to let it alone? What should people do?
So there are a few bat rehabbers in the state, including Squam Lakes has that. But in general, at different times of year, different things could be going on. So a lot of times when they're beginning to learn how to fly, we hear of a lot of bats because the juveniles, I kind of think of them as toddlers. They're a little bit klutzy and kind of figuring their way out. So they may end up somewhere they don't want to be or intention, so that can just be a matter of time. And then that evening they're going to move on to find a better place. Of course, with the rabies precaution, definitely do not have direct contact with them, but you can always call one of the wildlife rehabilitators or New Hampshire Fish and Game if you're concerned, and explain the situation, and we'll kind of, depending on the time of year, see what the best course. It can just be moving it to a high place where it's safe from predators for the day, and then it will fly off at night.
I'll say, and we often get questions from people who have them in their home. And so if you do find a bat in your house, they're similar to how they're looking for these maternity sites. They're just looking for a warm, like dark place to be. And like Sandy said, they don't want to be there. So if they accidentally do get into your living space, the best thing to do is to turn off the lights and then open up any outside windows and doors to the room. And hopefully they find their way outdoors on their own. So that's the fingers crossed that works.
So we had a question about what data do we have, if any, on the impact on insects of our decreasing bat populations?
I think I've just seen like anecdotal data, and I think probably there's more in other states. I recently saw a good piece on PBS where they showed some farmers in I think it was Georgia, so they were later to have white nose syndrome, where they were able to kind of think about how much insect damage there was, and so they were able to explain the change pre and post. But it's pretty limited here. We didn't know it was coming. We don't have the baseline as well.
Is there anyone doing captive breeding work for any of our endangered bats, or is that not something that's being invested in?
It hasn't been done successfully to date that I'm aware of, so it hasn't been successful. I guess would be. But certainly it has been a conservation strategy for other species.
So we've got a lot of fun comments going about people that are seeing bats and compared to how many they used to see versus, what they've seen in recent years.
I'm reading that. It's all people who can contribute their data, Sandy.
Yeah, so click that link that I put in earlier and sign up for the newsletter and check out the trainings. Let's see, so I think we answered the question about what to do if your bat's in your house. And there was a couple of questions about, can you find a roost by, if you see bats out flying, trying to follow them and see where they're going? Is that one way to find roost sites?
So they could be flying for quite a while, and then they often will have also a night roost where they might rest. That's oftentimes on people's porches or under bridges. So that would be, if you're right out at sunset and you see that they're active, then they might be nearby, and that could be a way. But following the bat back to the roost would be. I'd be impressed, and I'd love to hear about it if you do, but it might be quite challenging.
Yeah, especially because as it gets darker, they do have this fluttery flight pattern, so it's difficult to see and keep your eyes on them, which is why sometimes when you're counting, it's helpful to have multiple people watching and really focusing on those means of entry and exit so that you can be sure to tally them appropriately.
And then Ellen had a question about, do you use volunteers in visiting those maternity colony sites at all? Since Fish and Game or Extension doesn't have the resources to visit as many as you wish you could.
Well, I would say we ask people if they have maternity colonies on their own property to report them to us, and then also to count them. And then we have been in the process of developing a system where volunteers could sign up to monitor and count maternity colonies that are not on their property, that are either on someone else's property who's not able to count, or on conservation land. I'd say we were in the midst of planning and developing that training and process right when the COVID pandemic hit. And so at that point, we stopped encouraging people to count in large groups or to go on other people's properties to count. And so we just haven't picked that back up yet. But it will be the case in the future that we'll have sites you could sign up for and receive training about how to count those maternity colonies, and then sign up for a specific site, basically like an adopt a spot sort of program for these bat maternity colonies. But again, we can only have those sites if we hear about where these maternity colonies are and have landowners who are willing to have them counted, even if they're not able to do it themselves. So that's the first step.
Yeah, and here at Squam Lakes Natural Science Center, we've been participating in the summer bat colony count for the last few summers, and it is really a lot of fun. And we have a few volunteers that join us, and we coat ourselves in bug spray. That was the important step, I think, that Sandy mentioned. And we hang out there and we count until we can't see what we're writing anymore. we do use flashlights to try to extend that as long as we can, but it's been fun for us to see a bit of a recovery here in our bat houses at the Science Center. I think, you know, at our lowest, we had like 40 bats. We have 5 different bat houses. And, you know, pre-white nose, we had, you know, easily 500 bats in those bat houses. And that was counted with a different method than we're using now. So, but last summer, I forget the exact number, but we were back to having a few hundred bats. So it's really fun. It's great to see a little sign of hope. So I encourage you to attend the training and count some bats if you have some living at your house. It's really a lot of fun. That's just my commercial plug for you guys here. One more question from Paul and Barbara, and I'm not sure what this is in reference to, but they're asking, what are winter vines? Did one of you mention winter vines?
Wind turbines is what.
Oh, turbines, so windmills, power generating wind turbines. Thanks. Sorry, missed what that was in reference to.
And Audrey, I'm just going to put and everyone out there, I'm going to put a link in the chat to a page called wildlifehelp.org. And that's a really good website. I see just a couple more questions about having a bat in your house. What do you do? And we've mentioned these licensed wildlife control operators a couple of times. So that's a website that's sponsored in part by New Hampshire Fish and Game and has really good information. You can search by species and state to figure out, you know, state specific within the realm of the state's regulations, what you should be doing in New Hampshire to deal with problem bats and find licensed control operators for our state. So that's a good resource for folks who have questions about that.
Great. All right. I don't see any additional questions in the chat. So I want to thank Sandy and Haley so much for your time tonight, and thank you all so much for joining us. It was really a pleasure to have you here. Keep your eyes peeled for bats. Hopefully we'll continue to see a rise in our local bat numbers, and get involved and join a count and help out. And we look forward to seeing you on May 11th for our talk on zooplankton.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, and thanks to the high school students for
you.
joined us. That was cool to have you all here. So thanks, Piper, for bringing your students. All right, good night, everyone. Thank you.